Welcome to Between Shelves.
where we make connections between literature, theology, philosophy, psychology, and culture.
Join us as we explore the interconnectedness of race, spirituality, psychology, and metamodernism.
Each episode invites you into a thought-provoking journey, unpacking how these elements shape our understanding of the world and ourselves.
My name is Aaron Waldron. We're a religiously traumatized theopoet and a shaman in journey. Our work focuses on creating community and between spaces for religiously traumatized millennials, navigating life beyond colonized religion.
And my name is Rafael Reyes. My work is on the importance of imagination and theopoetics in philosophy and religious pluralism.
We invite you to Between Shelves
To learn,
listen,
and become.
All right, welcome to the next part of the dialogue. Today joining us is Brendan Dempsey, a leading voice in metamodern philosophy and cultural analysis. Brendan, please.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. Looking forward to discussing and getting into all this. I could just give a little bit of an intro to myself, I guess, and let people know where I'm coming from. I work a lot in the metamodern spirituality and meaning-making space. Written a number of books on metamodernism, including a book called Metamodernism, or The Cultural Logic of Cultural Logics. Yeah, I've been involved in metamodern conversations for well over a decade at this point. And I've just been really excited, not only by, let's say, what I originally found there, which was really promising for me in terms of navigating through and beyond postmodernism, but I've also been really excited by how that discourse has continued to sort of evolve and get expressed in new domains. And yeah, I have a podcast now called Metamodern Meaning, and it's all about exploring what is the meaning of the metamodern, what is meaning and meaning making in the metamodern era and metamodernity, metamodern paradigm, that sort of thing. So that's where a lot of my time and attention goes to, and really interested to explore the different topics that come up under that banner. So I'm looking forward to talking to you both today.
Just want to lift up, we've been reading your texts. I have some of your texts: Metamodernism, Return to Transcendence, God Emerging, your latest book. So they've been some great reads, and in every iteration, definitely seeing this more concretized, nuanced understanding of metamodernism, which really clarifies a lot and really helps, I guess, people to really understand what metamodernism is doing, right? It's sort of like I don't want to use the mirror, but maybe it's that oscillation, going back and we're seeing, oh, this is what it is. This is what it's about. And I was wondering if you could at least give us just a taste of the latest text that you have on, the cultural logics one. Because I believe there's some really interesting nuggets there that really helps us when we start talking about metamodernism's take on identity formation on that stand.
Sure. Yeah. Well, what I try to do in the Metamodernism book that came out last year, called Metamodernism or A Cultural Logic of Cultural Logics, is essentially look across the discourse and look at the different people using the term, how they've been using it, and what commonalities there are between the different strands of this emerging discourse. So I begin by looking at the whole emergence of the term in cultural studies and art analysis. There's a chapter on aesthetics. And then I get into the kind of Hansi Freinacht and complexity movement that's kind of found a common cause with this term and this engagement with the meta. So how that kind of plays out in the natural sciences is an aspect that figures into this. Get into the work of Jason Storm, who's written a brilliant kind of systemic philosophy under that term, metamodernism, the future of theory. So I look at a lot of different metamodern thinkers, and I'm trying to kind of assess what is the architecture here that kind of unites these different usages of this term. If we're all kind of talking broadly about the same thing, which is like, postmodernism, how do we move through the postmodern by means of the postmodern? There's some kind of move like that that's going on in all these different thinkers. And So then I'm just trying to kind of see, all right, well, if that's kind of what we're looking at, it's a little bit like, finding the different, the different, what unites this kind of conversation in a kind of deeper way. So yeah, I propose this notion that one way of thinking about the postmodern or the metamodern is as a kind of decentering self-reflection process that goes on, where in a sense, as we move through culture, there's a kind of natural tendency for people to reflect on what they're inheriting from culture in its sort of broad terms, in these kind of epochal ways, and kind of make an object of that, and then allow them to analyze and critique, reflect on, and try to then sort of move beyond, I guess you could say, transcend the limitations that get disclosed from that sort of vantage. So, in telling the story of metamodernism, metamodernity, usually people have recourse to talking about the modern, postmodern, and if you're going to talk about the modern and the postmodern, also then the premodern factors in and these sorts of things. So you've got some kind of a sequence here. And I think that we can, understand this in a reasonable way as modernity reflecting on what it then came to call the premodern, kind of distancing itself from it, identifying itself in relation to it, reflecting on it, critiquing it, and trying to move beyond it. And that produced certain kinds of ways of thinking, fed into new kinds of worldviews, new kinds of values, these sorts of things. And then similarly, the postmodern is a similar kind of move of people thinking about modernity and the stories that were told there, the values that were held there. But again, kind of taking modernity almost as its own whole kind of object of analysis, and then critiquing it, reflecting on it, drawing out the limitations and shining a light on what was left out of that picture. And so similarly, when we talk about the postmodern, there's a lot that comes there that is trying to extend the frame, right? It's sort of like trying to get outside of the limits of that frame of modernity, trying to see what's on the periphery, what was marginalized, right? What were the different ways that modern power structures were leaving things out or silencing things, etc. So there's trying to bring more into the picture. And similarly, then you could say, well, maybe this metamodern thing is doing something similar, but now it's doing it with the postmodern, right? What was the postmodern taking for granted? What was it leaving out of its picture? So there's kind of a structural move that you could kind of say, all right, well, whatever these different kinds of metamodernisms are, they all seem to be doing something like that. And they might be attending to different aspects of this process in culture or different domains. Some people might be looking at this in art. Some people might be doing more philosophical moves. Some people might be trying to look across the different disciplines and try to bring them together in this sort of way. But that's kind of the move I'm trying to make there, and as a sort of way to synthesize all of the different aspects of the conversation. So when I talk about metamodernism, part of that meta is its own kind of self-aware stance that this kind of meta move is needed, right? We need to step back from things. We need to go meta on things. We need to situate them in from the vantage of a broader context, because that brings more into the picture. It complexifies our understanding of reality, and it gives us, a fuller sense of what's going on. So I see that as sort of a progressive move that we're able to then, progressively advance by trying to be more self-reflective and try to correct for the various ways that we're leaving things out of the picture. And I think that metamodernism then could be understood as sort of the most recent iteration of that. Certainly not the last one, not the final one, but maybe the most recent that we're experiencing. And that's I guess that's what I'll say about that for now. It, in sum, allows us to kind of take into our ken the virtues, but also the pitfalls of the pre-modern, the modern, and the postmodern, to try to get sort of as comprehensive and inclusive a picture as possible.
Awesome. Aaron, I don't know if you wanted to ask anything here.
Yeah. I actually had a question. In terms of fluidity, especially with identity, my question was, while metamodernism values fluidity, is there a danger of losing the ability to define collective identities necessary for solidarity and social movements, for example?
Yeah, great question. I mean, one of the ways of thinking about that postmodern move is by understanding the way that identity becomes much more sort of micro level in a postmodern orientation, right? The grand narratives of history that were popular under modernity get critiqued, and they say, hey, wait a second, maybe this isn't everyone's story. Maybe this is leaving people out. Maybe this is very intentionally, kind of steamrolling over some stories to tell this story, right? And so there was an important reaction to this kind of totalizing nature of modernity in that way. And so we go from kind of macro narratives or meta narratives of modernity to micro narratives and postmodernity. And I think this accounts for a lot of people's focus on and an interest in, maybe even a kind of cultural obsession with identity and who am I? Where do I fit in my own kind of more local context in a way that isn't just about telling some universal tale of humanity necessarily, but it's like what subculture am I a part of? What particular group or class or race or whatever do I identify with by breaking up sort of the monolithic nature of the one story into many stories? And so that's a really good and important move to do, because when we have monoliths and we have sort of totalizing things, a lot of detail and complexity is left out, and there's obviously power aspects that go into whose story gets told and whose doesn't. At the same time, there are, cons, you could say, to those pros, right? Where we're now, if we're in a world where everyone sort of has a micro narrative, how do we get collective solidarity? How do we work together on the big projects, right? And like climate change is a big one, for example, right? I mean, that is a genuinely global planetary issue. And there's a sense in which we could be playing a role in that story because it affects all of us. At the same time, if we're unable to speak across these differences because we emphasize so much our own kind of unique, idiosyncratic aspects of our identities rather than our more universal aspects, then we're limiting ourselves in a moment of great collective need. So I think that there is an element in metamodern thinking to kind of try to recoup some of those positive aspects of more broad human storytelling, and to at the very least appreciate that there are pros and cons to a lot of the different ways that we might choose to tell any kinds of stories. And being aware of that is important. When we critique something for maybe how it has failed in the past, there's also the ability then to move beyond just critique. We can also then, once we've digested that critique, start to say, hey, what is the critique leaving out of the picture? The kind of classic throwing the baby out with the bathwater sort of thing, right? So again, that's part of that bringing more into the picture. So we don't want our expanding of the frame to cause us to in turn push new things out of the picture, right? We want to somehow be able to see, well, what was maybe useful or helpful about bigger storytelling, about bigger forms of identity, while also being able to, contextualize those against their critiques. So yeah, I think that we find ourselves, for many reasons, returning to, bigger kinds of storytelling about ourselves collectively and individually, with kind of a new sense of openness to how we can make use of that without it falling into all of the pitfalls that, modern versions of that did. So anyway, that's just like a first pass at that, but it's a really important issue and it's a really important question.
Definitely. As you were talking, we were thinking of how, for example, like narratives from the Bible could then be adopted in a meta way. But if we don't, critically analyze how these narratives have been used for manipulative or exploitative purposes, we could find ourselves bringing that into the meta narrative and then harming even more people. But yeah, I really like what you said, because it made me think about that oscillation, like Raphael was talking about, between that micro and macro. But it is hard, isn't it? Like, how do we sit here and talk about a framework that is supposed to, in theory, include everything, but then talk about the everyday mundane? I feel like this is very challenging. Do you have any thoughts on that at all?
Well, I mean, what I would say is, I think, at least just in my own experience, being able to connect my daily life to a bigger picture has been very helpful for me. It's a source of great meaning. It's what makes getting out of bed every day and then relating my everyday experience to something bigger. That's what makes that significant, in a sense that I think we're in danger of losing if we only focus on that more mundane everyday sort of experience. And I think that postmodern move was really about focusing more on the particular. There's a kind of way that you can see these patterns across history where these pendulum swings between, are we focusing on the universal and the, totalizing picture, or are we focusing on just the small and the particular? And you could, I think, broadly speaking, interpret the modernist gesture as being very generalizing, universalizing, quote unquote. It's trying to, talk about, the big archetypal, kinds of ways of telling human stories. But, it's reflective of the way that those stories were told when, people would talk about the story of man, and that sort of thing, right? Because like even that kind of language signals, wait, well, what about woman? What about, you know what I mean? So that was where it started. A lot of postmodern thinking comes in to be like, wait a second, this universal story, what else is not part of that story? And so as a result, tends to emphasize much more the particularity. And wants to focus on, all right, well, maybe even if that is man's story, what about woman's story, right? And then, of course, then you can get that kind of iteratively going on itself. Well, it's like, well, wait a second, a woman is not a monolith. Like, what about Black women's experiences and, Latina experience? All right, so then you can start to have the cascade of sort of getting more and more granular with the kinds of particular ways that people experience the world and have stories. And so a lot of, I think, the postmodern umbrella of concern has been trying to zoom more and more into that greater particularity and look at it on its own terms. I would say then there is that need to eventually, in a sense, do a kind of zooming back out and a kind of back and forth so that you're able to, not, in a sense, lose the forest for the trees, and not just look at the forest and not the trees. So you've got to be able to do kind of a multi-scalar kind of oscillatory move, I think, to get more of that big picture. So I think that that's part of what that metamodern move is trying to gesture to, is like trying to find the ways to do that. We should be aware of like the ways that that can go wrong, right? Like there's all sorts of ways that trying to make this move could wind up smuggling in just sort of like covert aspects to try to totalitarianly, take over the story again. We want to be wary of that and on guard. At the same time, I do think just only living in the focus on the particular sort of inherently causes that particularity to lose context, to lose relationship, right? It's not just about being, I don't think, a singular story of a very particular kind. It's about how does your very particular story relate to other people's very particular stories? And isn't that in its own way sort of a generality, you could say? Or how do we, paint the meshwork or the network of all the different particular stories into something that is kind of a more global network of particularity, right? So trying to do different sort of scalar moves, I think, reveals different things and different ways of thinking about story and identity, which I think is really important because it helps us not to lose the thread, lose the plot, lose the bigger stories that do, I think, helpfully connect us. A lot of what we need to maybe think about is what sorts of stories could we genuinely and legitimately tell about ourselves at a larger level that isn't necessarily exclusionary of those greater particularities, but somehow inclusive of them, right? So we might have to get better at our storytelling. We might have to think more broadly, more expansively. But I don't think we should give up at that level or scale of storytelling. I think that a lot of what the metamodern insight is gesturing towards is the recognition of the importance of some big stories. But again, I think it's all in the how do we do that is a challenge.
Definitely. Raphael, real quick, do you have any thoughts? Did you want to jump in?
I've been writing notes as Brendan's been talking. It's interesting. You're combining storytelling and particularity, and then this sort of generality and oscillating back and forth. I've been, and I think you also mentioned it's important that we have everyone's stories even within that. I think that was the general piece, and my mind started to reflect on this idea that when we're looking at metamodernism right now and where it is arising from, which is still mostly European And we see some heavy writing on the Nordic side, which I'm so grateful for their writing and how they're bringing it forward. And I think Lena Anderson is one of the more, she has that network that I'm a part of. And I think that's wonderful. But they talk about very vaguely this space of race, which on the Western side is predominantly important, even in today's context. And we even see that, and I think we're seeing that metamodernism is looking at big pictures, right? When we're looking at more these larger stories of climate crisis as a big issue, the ways we formulate knowledge, still big issues, but then still getting lost the question of race, which is still a question that is deeply rooted in identity, that could be particular, but is also general, right? It depends. And we could say, if let's say if metamodernism kind of does away a little bit with race, then we're losing on that particularity that's so important, because a lot of what is the United States or these other formations that's in Africa or in India, we are who we are because of the colonization and all these things. And so there's a little bit of heaviness as I'm trying to build this. I'm still struggling within metamodernism to see how it can respond in a better way to this area. I'm not looking for an answer, but maybe just, the struggle with that. How does that, who needs to be involved? Maybe there's a good question, right? As we're thinking about that in terms of race, who should be involved in that? Are we inviting those that we need to speak in that area? That's the question that I was pondering as you're talking, because I think your statement on storytelling is valid and important, right? I think when we look at Foucault's, that's sort of like the marginalization of knowledge, and it's breaking through the universal knowledge. That archaeological then framework of digging and looking at genealogies are so vastly important, because it allows for these marginalized knowledges then to move forth. But to what you're saying, we still need to still think about these bigger pictures. Well, how do we navigate so that everyone has validity and importance in there?
Yeah, well, I mean, these are big questions. And of course, I should situate myself in all of this, right? I mean, so to your point, like, I think that any attempt to, let's say, disregard or leave out of the picture race, I think that would not be the right approach. That we want to take in the biggest picture possible, I guess you could say, right? And that includes some of these categories that I think we can deal more or less productively with, I suppose, right? And I think a lot of the times, some of the aspects that have come out of the clarification of these categories, again, I think we get stuck in maybe too simplistic versions of them, right? So if you go back to like initial racial conceptions that were very popular in modernity, they were pseudoscientific. They were, they were social constructions that obviously served people in power, et cetera. So we can do that kind of deconstructive analysis of it. But then we also don't want to get stuck in a certain kind of deconstructive move where race is now just a social construction. One, where then we don't appreciate that, well, social constructions can have incredible power to shape people's experiences, right? So there's an element in which social constructions can be real in that way and have incredible impacts. If we're going to do intelligent thinking around these topics, we need to be able to deconstruct them. We also need to see how their role as constructions still has power. And then we want to be able to hold some of these things simultaneously in all of their kind of paradoxes where neither one of those poles necessarily predominates. Anyway, so I just say all that because race needs to be a part of this conversation, but a nuanced and critical notion of race that doesn't either overly reify it or essentialize it, doesn't overly, I'd say, equate its social constructed nature with it being just a total fiction that therefore, well, we can ignore, or something like that, right? So there's a lot to try to hold in your head around some kinds of topics like that. And we need that kind of nuance to be happening simultaneously. And I think that's generally, unfortunately, rare because it does make a lot of demands on people to be able to hold all of that. And what does that mean? And And anyway, so I say all that first off, and then, that being said, then we have to think about what, how we deploy these categories from that stance, right? So I think it is like important to make moves of, recognizing, owning my racial identity in the terms that we're talking about, and situating myself relative to that, situating, privilege relative to that, etc. I think that those are important moves to make. I do think it's also, we don't want to just let that terminate in a kind of performance that doesn't change anything either, right? So then it's like, okay, so we want to acknowledge these things, work within what they mean, but we also want to not let it just rest there. We want to be able to hopefully do something productive, generative with all this. And yeah, we also don't want to get lost in just a kind of politicization through these categories either, right? Where unfortunately I see a lot of this in more kind of postmodern standard academic discourse, where if we can gesture to, if we can name these things, if we can deconstruct them, then we've kind of done the work or something. And I don't think that's right. I think that that's a beginning, right? So I think that that's a question to, spend a lot of time exploring. I think, granted everything I've just said about where I'm coming from in terms of my identity here, I'm going to also own that I probably shouldn't be the loudest person in the room talking about those particular issues, right? So I also want to be learning and listening from people who do need to be brought into that conversation, whose perspectives are going to be the sort that, are and to that point, we want an expansive conversation, and I don't see that a whole lot yet in the metamodern discourse space. I think it does skew white, it skews male. And so I think there's certainly more value the more diverse that this discourse can become, and the more perspectives that it can take in. There's obviously the irony isn't lost on a bunch of white European descendants talking about, seeing the biggest picture possible, right? When it's all just a bunch of white guys in a room, patting themselves on the back for being comprehensive or something. So we want to avoid all that. But that is participatory. It's an invitation. We want to do all this while at the same time not just making. We don't want to fall into tokenization traps either, where we just say, all right, well, we need more people of color in metamodern discourse. So, and then all the problems that come with that. So, I don't know, those are a couple of initial responses. I'd love to see this, conversation diversify in all these ways. But I'm just kind of doing what I can from my position, from where I'm at, and I think conversations like this help, bring these stuff into the conversation. But I certainly acknowledge my own limitations in being able to, advance that beyond what I can. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Hope we didn't bring it out in that way that you're supposed to answer for everything.
No, I it's, these are big topics, and it's like one can reflect on them, and one wants to make intellectual progress on these sorts of things, but we're also talking about social progress. We're also talking about movement progress, and philosophical opinions mean one thing, but then we also have to do all this other kind of work. And so, again, the most I can do in this particular context is gesture to that kind of work. Yeah, but I also don't want that to, reek of a kind of empty gesture either.
Hey listeners, are you ready to challenge the way you think about identity and the stories we tell about ourselves? In this episode of Between Shelves, we're diving deep into the world of Metamodernism, a cultural movement that's reshaping how we see identity in the 21st century. We're thrilled to be joined by Brendan Dempsey, a leading voice in metamodern philosophy and cultural analysis. Together, we're exploring the fluidity, paradox, and multiplicity of identity in a world where the old rules just don't seem to fit anymore. From literature to philosophy, art, and spirituality, we're unpacking how metamodernism disrupts outdated frameworks around race, gender, culture, and belonging, opening up new possibilities for connection and self-discovery. Whether you're a seeker, a scholar, or just curious about the evolution of identity in our ever-changing world, this episode has something for you. So grab your favorite book and headphones to tune in. This is a dialogue you won't want to miss. Catch the latest episode of Between Shelves, streaming now on all your favorite podcast platforms. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. Let's explore the in-between together. And now, let's get back to our fascinating dialogue with Brendan Dempsey as we continue to unpack how metamodernism challenges the way we think about identity, belonging, and what it truly means to become in the 21st century.
I'm appreciative of these points that you brought across. I think for us, and I'll speak for myself first, and then Aaron, you can. I think what's so fascinating about metamodernism is its approach is definitely more of inquiry, adventure. I'm a Whiteheadian by nature, so Alfred North Whitehead in his process thought talks about that, this idea of adventure of ideas, and his process framework and thinking is very akin to metamodernism. I would almost argue that a piece needs to be written that he probably is a forerunner to metamodernism with his philosophy of organism. And a lot of what I read has these familiar tones. So when think in your text, your latest one last year, moving away from these hierarchical frameworks to these layered, and in his book Religion in the Making, he talks about how feelings, experiencing, then emotion, then thinking, and then thinking for oneself are layers of experience of everyone. They're not hierarchies. It's not that this is the most important, but they're layered and can happen in different ways. And then his framework of thinking is in that framework as well. It's layered and needs to talk to one another. It moves back and forth. It moves within fields of force as opposed to dichotomies or binaries. So metamodernism has this familiar feel for me as we look at it on a cultural scale. And so I'm very appreciative of that. I'd almost also want to argue that being a Latino, myself, I'm Puerto Rican, born and raised in Queens in New York, so here in the Western States, I am very familiar with being in a hybrid space as well. Having to oscillate back and forth and doing something called code switching does something. So once again, I'm taking your terms and I'm saying there's a familiarity with it that I think we have hoped becomes part of the conversation, and we're starting to see it. And because of that, I'm really interested, and I'll go back to this idea of then what will metamodernism do to identity in that sense? Because we're, as a Latino moving, like I said, we're in a liminal space or a hybrid space. Unfortunately, it's been one of a major cultural space, and then we're in the minor and having to navigate those two worlds. And I think metamodernism is saying, well, no, everyone's equal or same playing field. And then what does that do to our identity and becoming who we are? And then I'm also curious about, is that something that can take on really and truly in, let's say, the Western world? Because there's also these other battles of ideologies going on there as well.
Yeah.
You don't have to answer all of that. I'm just thinking
out
loud.
No, it's great. And I mean, I'm glad you brought it up. The idea of code switching, I think, is definitely kind of one connection where this mode of being, I think can really connect with people's lived experience at that level of navigating different communities, different expectations, different social norms, and what that feels like. And that can cut across different kinds of identity markers, right? So any time when someone who has a kind of cross section of different identities where one is being drawn out of them in a different context, that is going to activate that kind of, that embodied sense of the need for switching, for oscillating, for moving between contexts. And so I do think that, because that can show up in different ways, it's sort of a more abstract or generalizable trait, you could say. So it could happen by showing up in different ethnic spaces, racial spaces, gendered spaces, etc., power spaces. But it also shows up in minor ways. I mean, so for just in my own experience, I went to a different school for every year of my life up until high school, and just there wasn't really a particularly good reason for that. It was just entirely contingent. I didn't really move around a lot, but in terms of my schooling, it was a different one every year. And even that requires a kind of, or it imposes a kind of shifting context imposition on the mind, right? So one year I'm here and I have to relate to these folks in this way. Oh, now I'm over here and now I've got to. And then also because you do something like that, well, you've gone through maybe 3 or 4 of these now, and now you have a sense of, oh yeah, I'm shifting contexts again. I know what this feels like. So it starts to give you kind of a meta awareness of the process. And that's just in, one way in which my own experience of multiple contexts, I think, has kind of primed me for the kind of metamodern notion of oscillation, moving between perspective, this sort of thing. But again, that is I think, a phenomenon that different people experience in different ways, depending on the makeup of their kind of identity cross sections. So I think that there will be different ways that people's experiences with that phenomenon will bring them unique insights. So like being a white guy, I'm not necessarily going to experience the specific code switching experience that someone would who, let's say you're a black intellectual, right? And, 1 second you're hanging out in the halls of Harvard and you've got to use that code. And then the other second you're with your family and now you're using that code. That the kind of racial and power differentials that are at play there aren't going to be something I will have experienced or will experience. But I'll have my own different kinds of versions of that. And there are different ways, again, that process can play out. So I think what, again, we could draw on is different people's experiences of this kind of phenomenon based on all the ways that they do identify and the different contexts that they are operating in, to get a bigger picture of what this is like to navigate all these different situations, to try to have to move between these different hybrid spaces. And, I do think we also want to acknowledge power as being a significant aspect of that. But I think one of the failures of postmodernism is almost the absolutization of power differentials as like the criterion for assessing everything, right? Like it is a super important one, but there are many other sociological ways you could slice that pie, and we're naming some of them, and probably there's others we haven't even begun to identify yet. So I think that, again, we want to pluralize the kinds of insights that you get from some of those postmodern forms of analysis by going meta on them, by situating what they were identifying as actually being just a subset of a broader class of phenomena. And I think that can also help get out of some of the binds, some of the too constrained boxes that a lot of sort of more postmodern power analysis has kind of filtered everything into. Often, I wouldn't say often, what's the language I want to use for this? It's not always the most productive, right? Sometimes it really is. Sometimes that's just the level of analysis that you need, the kind of analysis that you need, because that is the issue at hand. Sometimes it's kind of a square peg round hole. So we want to be able to, I think, again, kind of, find the mode of analysis that fits best for the kinds of, considerations at play in these different contexts. And, anyway, there's a lot more I could say about that. Hopefully I'm not getting too abstract here, but I think these are the sorts of moves into like a metamodern kind of identity analysis, power analysis, social analysis, critical analysis that I think like actually move through, take up and extend the notions of postmodern analysis, but are able to do new things with them because of how kind of pluralizing they are with them. Something like that.
I'm curious because it seems like you're saying something similar to what postmodernism says about identity, that um, our identity is dynamic in a real way because, like you mentioned, the multiple spaces that you've been in speaks to the growth of your identity, and your identity is growing. It is what it is at the present moment, but shifts at the next moment. So it has this dynamicity to it, even though you're still trying to find commonalities within that identity.
Yeah, no, I think, and there are multiple axes of that dynamism, right? I'm really interested myself in various kinds of personality development models and psychological development models, but that's just one sort of mode of dynamism. But it's maybe as an example, it's helpful because, right, like your ego development, your personality development, well, in some ways you're always you, but the you that you are changes, right? And it actually changes reliably and maybe even follows certain structural patterns in some ways. And so there are ways in which we are, a one, a unity, an identity, but there are also crucial ways in which that identity is a multifold plurality. And that in kind of Whiteheadian processual terms, we have to situate that as in flux, as, dynamic, as undergoing change and transformation. So there's that, right? But then there's also ways, so that's a particular kind of unity in difference. But all the other ways that we're talking about as well, of our social identities and different kinds of, the identity markers that, of various kinds that we use to make sense of ourselves, those are going to be shifting over time. Those are going to be coming out in different ways, in different contexts and all of that. So there's a lot of ways in which, yes, there's a fundamentally dynamic nature to all of this, and a million different sort of axes along which we can assess that. And I think trying to appreciate both sides of that polarity of like that changingness, but also what is constant, or if not constant, at least, I talk a lot about continuities and discontinuities. I think it's always really helpful to be able to track those in meaningful ways, because we are, when we talk about ourselves and our identities, we are talking about a thing that has continuity through time, but there are also discontinuities to that as well. So again, I think, being more precise, more nuanced, more detailed, and higher granularity, being able to get into all the dynamics that go into this, that's really important. And I think postmodernism kind of opened the door for some of that, but I think we can blow that up even more. We can get really fine grained about these sorts of things. And I think as we do that, also people will feel more of themselves is being seen, because it is including more aspects of that dynamism, those changes and everything that's going on for them. Right now, we have a kind of rubric of a set of established ways of doing this kind of analysis that come out of postmodern thinking that people might be familiar with, but maybe it's a little bit too constrained, right? So again, trying to just multiply that many-fold and say, all right, yeah, we could look at it at this angle, we could look at it at this angle, but actually all of these different angles, the more of them that we can take into account, the bigger, fuller picture we're going to have of this. And ultimately, that's less constraining than our current kind of ways of slicing the pie. Again, this is I hope this is not like it's such fascinating stuff, like theoretically, but I don't want to go too far out there theoretically wise, but I hope this is landing in a kind of embodied way too.
For me, I'm enjoying it.
Cool.
Well, I'm in the theoretical part myself, but thinking about what that means in praxis is always a little bit more difficult, even though in metamodernity it's very pragmatic, right? I mean, part of metamodernism is its pragmatic nature, I think, which speaks to what you're saying. That's why there's a plurality, different responses, different identities, different times. And if I'm taking from your text, is that you have to kind of hover over it, right, to get that sort of meta response. Right, I'm looking at everything because I want to see and speak to those differences, acknowledge them, so that there's a voice for it. Doesn't have to be my voice, but there's a voice for it, and that it's seen as, and it becomes part of a matrices, if you will, of possibilities.
Yeah.
So that, and then that, and just one more piece.
Yeah.
So that when you're looking at it from a general, that general is really complex. It's really just a complex weaving, and not, it can look simplistic, but like I said, in the Whiteheadian space, when you enter into it much more deeply, you're going to see its complexity as you hover over it, because, oh, look at this thread and how this is done, and the different color nuances, and how they went this way, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, it's a great analogy or metaphor image of the hovering over, and it also raises its own challenges pragmatically, right? Because we want to be able to fully inhabit these different parts of ourselves in the moment, in the context. We don't necessarily always want to be looking down at the like the meta context. Like, we need that meta context space to be able to, relate everything together and all these different aspects of identity. But we shouldn't necessarily live there. Right? If it's like, if I go to have Thanksgiving dinner with my family or something like that, and I'm only attending to, just the whole like sociological picture of everything that's unfolding, and like maybe deep critiques that I have related to all that, then I can't just be there with my family. So part of that code switching, in a sense, is like levels of analysis and being able to move between them, and to know in an embodied way and in a practical way, like when a particular mode is called for, so that you can then just sort of fully inhabit as necessary any particular aspect of yourself, in an optimal way. I think that that's really key.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. Just as a side, the hovering is from John Sallis. I think it's his book Force of the Imagination. So it's not mine. But I've taken his thought on how he sees imagination and structures
Cool.
forming. He calls on a hovering over for that. I think it's a brilliant way of seeing it, and all of that. I really appreciate what you said there in terms of when you're analyzing, you're kind of closing off
Mm-hmm.
to presence, which is what I think you were saying. And the idea of presence is important because if you don't have presence, you don't have meaning making. And I think that's part of your work too, the
Yeah.
meaning making. So go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that also connects really well with what you were saying earlier about layering, right? It's not that, we always just want to be at the maximally most complex level, and that makes a kind of crude hierarchy of it, right? Rather, we see that there are these different layers, and that they are all, there to be called upon as needed, or as we could. And there's certainly a value in being able to hover to get that vantage, right? So I'm not saying that it's all one. It's not like a radically relativistic picture of this. There is a kind of value going there, but there's also value in coming, away from that. And so, yeah, I think when, gave that kind of Whiteheadian stack of things that are kind of part of the mix there, and there are times when just purely being with the emotion is the kind of right thing to do. There are times when being really analytical are the right things to do. And I think this whole, meaning making aspects, it comes in the wisdom that one can achieve by knowing which layer to find applicable in a particular situation.
Yeah. Funny enough, the idea that comes from it, and from a religious standpoint, is you don't want to start analyzing a song of worship in the middle of a song, right? You kind of want to stick within the emotion or how it makes you feel, but then afterwards to reflect on it, maybe because a hymnal has theological value and meaning for the life. So and the feeling at the moment may be due to an event that happened. And then the theological value has more pertinence in finding meaning making. I mean, you need all of those components. I think it lends to what you're speaking on this idea that we're multiple in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
We feel in various ways, we think in various ways. And if we're only holding on to one, then we kind of lose out on the beauty that comes from these other layers that make us who we are in that sense.
Yeah. You guys made me think of how humans are trying to teach AI about emotions. Like what you're talking about, like an AI algorithm can hover very well, hover over a massive amount of information, whereas the human has the ability to be present, and all that data is in feeling, whereas the AI is trying to analytically break it down and explain things and understand things. We think humans have intuition that allows them to presently pull in this data without having to go to Harvard or Yale or be highly intellectual, but somehow can process intellectual data, complex data, in the moment. So I find it interesting. I like watching films and, the stories where they have humans trying to teach a robot, which is an AI algorithm, a teaching algorithm. How do you learn emotions? How do you learn being present and feeling the wind, or embracing a butterfly, or, these very small things that we find beauty in, and poetry and, Even Sufism does a great job of blending sacred with the beauty of the mundane. Trying to explain that to an algorithm or an analytical, logical process of thinking that's hovering over everything, it just reminds us that we can't remain there, like you said, Brandon. It's so true. Trying to find that balance is just the oscillation between the two.
Yeah, well, and to that, I would also say that like there is profound intelligence in our emotion, right? In our embodied experience of things. And, there are great models. I'm fond of using the unified theory of knowledge UTalk framework to look at the different levels of complexification of the cosmos and whatnot, and it gives matter, life, mind, and culture, these different kind of emergent planes of complexity, and we have all of those in ourselves. We're material stuff, we are biological entities, we are minded animals, and we are cultured persons. And the cultured persons part just comes from using language to talk about things, and a lot of that hovering over analytical mode is just the language part. The AI stuff is really just language, they're large language models, right? But then they lack the deeper intelligences that historically gave rise to those, which is, the minded animal layer of ourselves, our neuronal connections, our biological substrate. We're talking about billions of years of evolution that have produced this kind of complexity. And there's a way in which if we just treat that top layer as sort of like, the be all end all, we're actually not attending to the deep intelligent levels that have led to that, and that is necessarily grounded in, right? As soon as the top layer here gets disconnected from the deep intelligence of the body, of the animal organism, of the living organism, then, well, actually, I would say that in many ways, the blind spot of a lot of thinking that's very prevalent in like Silicon Valley and various kind of transhumanist utopias that people are attracted to, where we'll upload our brain into a computer, this sort of thing, is missing this issue specifically, because it thinks you can detach the linguistically mediated conceptual headspace, complex analytical mode from the deep intelligence of the substrates that gave rise to it. And I think it's, again, a deep wisdom to appreciate, no, that's all one stack, and when you can see that, then it's about how do we move in and out of and up and down that stack, appropriately. But that's kind of vital anthropology to kind of know what we are as people and what we are as identities.
Definitely. I think we are at the end of our time, and to respect everyone's time, this was an amazing dialogue. Was there any closing thoughts that anybody wanted to get out?
Well, I have a request. Brendan, once first, I definitely enjoyed the conversation. Um, Definitely loved, picking at your brain and talking about these things. I would love to have you over again to maybe focus a little bit on metamodernism and religion, because I know a lot of your earlier works was on transcendence and the religious stuff. We've been talking about identity right now, which is a part of it, right? But would love to have you back and maybe talk a little bit on that sort of religious side and how you brought in certain aspects on that, and looked at other persons who talked to that.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'd love that. This was a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate the invitation. And yeah, I mean, that's really the bulk of my interest and work and passion is about, religion, I think, as part of the broader meaning making processes that we do as humans, which certainly relates to identity, but it also goes into many other areas. And so, what is meaning, and how does religion fit into that? How does notions of the sacred fit into that? That's kind of my big focus at the moment. So would love to come back on and love to talk about that. And I don't really have anything really to add other than just a deep appreciation. I appreciate the opportunity to dig into some stuff that I haven't had an occasion to in other contexts. And so this was sort of fresh terrain for me. And I appreciate, you guys drawing that out, and I appreciate hearing your perspectives. And I think these kinds of conversations are really important, and really they contribute a lot to this space. So thank you for what you're doing with this. And looking forward to continuing it.